Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the hidden world Thomas Jefferson built behind Monticello's famous walls, a sprawling, obsessive garden kept alive by hands history rarely names. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the day go. Whatever it held, the noise, the obligations, the small urgencies that seemed so pressing only an hour ago, let them drift back like clouds moving away from a window. They will wait. You do not need them now. A man is walking in a garden. He moves slowly, deliberately, the way people move when they are not walking anywhere in particular, when the walking itself is the point. He bends down to examine something growing near the path. He reaches out one finger and touches the edge of a leaf. This is where we begin. Not with laws or declarations. Not with history as we were taught it, loud and important and finished. But with a garden. With soil and seeds and the patient, private work of a lifetime spent trying to understand what it means to tend something living. Settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let the story come to you slowly, the way all good things come, without rushing, without noise. Part 1: The Mountain He Chose. There is a question worth sitting with before we explain anything. Why a mountain? Most wealthy Virginians of the 18th century built their grand houses in the lowlands, along the rivers, the James, the Rappahannock, the Potomac. The rivers were the roads of colonial life. They carried tobacco downstream to ships, and ships carried tobacco across the ocean to England, and England sent back money and goods in the sense, however fragile, of belonging to something larger. The great plantation houses of Westover, Stratford Hall, Carter's Grove sat close to the water, wide-windowed and imposing, facing the direction from which everything important arrived. Thomas Jefferson chose a hill instead. A small mountain, really what the local Monacan people had long called by a name meaning something like the rocky place above. Jefferson translated it, in Italian, as Monticello. Little mountain. He chose it, he built on it, he spent the better part of his life shaping it, and the choice itself tells you something about the man before you learn a single biographical fact. He was born not far away, on a plantation called Shadwell, in Albemarle County, Virginia, in April of 1743. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a surveyor and planter, a self-made man in the rugged colonial sense, comfortable but not aristocratic, known more for his physical strength and practical intelligence than for social refinement. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of the oldest and most prestigious families in Virginia. Jefferson inherited something from each of them, the Randolph elevation and the surveyor's eye, the planter's instinct for land and the family tradition of knowing what a piece of Virginia was worth. But where the land was concerned, Jefferson's feelings went far beyond the practical. From boyhood, he moved through the natural world with the focused attention of someone who was always taking notes, always measuring, always asking what this plant was, what that formation meant, how the water moved, where the frost came first. He would later say that he considered the greatest service a man could render his country to be the introduction of a useful plant. Not a law. Not a military victory. A plant. He was perhaps 14 years old when he first climbed the small mountain above Shadwell with any serious intention. The forest there was old and dense, tulip poplars and white oaks, hickories and chestnut trees, with the canopy closing over the rocky ridgeline and the light coming through in long, shifting columns. At the very top, when you pushed through the last of the undergrowth and stepped out onto the open summit, the view was, and still is, extraordinary. To the west, the Blue Ridge Mountains ran along the horizon like a slow sentence written by someone in no hurry to finish. The valleys between them were blue-gray with distance and haze, layered like silk. To the east, the Piedmont fell away in rolling hills toward the tidewater and the sea. Standing there on a clear day, you could see for 40 miles. You could see weather moving. You could watch storm clouds build over the mountains while the valley below you still lay in sunlight. For Jefferson, this view was not just beautiful. It was instructive. It was the landscape opened up for examination. He was, from his earliest years, a person who needed to see the whole thing, not just the piece in front of him. The mountain gave him that. It gave him altitude. And altitude, for a mind like his, was not just physical. He began planning to build there when he was probably around 17 or 18, perhaps earlier. The first recorded mention of a house on the mountain comes from around 1767, when Jefferson was 24. But the idea had been forming for years before that, taking shape in notebooks and rough sketches, in the way young ambitious people carry their dreams, not fully formed, but constant, always being revised. The work of clearing this summit began in the late 1760s. Jefferson, newly trained as a lawyer and beginning to manage his father's estate after Peter Jefferson's death in 1757, directed the grading and leveling of the mountaintop. It was enormous physical labor. The rocky summit had to be flattened, the trees removed, the soil moved and compacted. Workmen, enslaved men, primarily, whose labor made every aspect of Monticello possible and whose lives ran alongside Jefferson's in a relationship of dependency and contradiction that we will return to, those men cut and hauled and leveled for months. Jefferson moved into the first small building on the mountain in 1770, when a fire at Shadwell destroyed the main house there and made his choice urgent. A single brick pavilion, now called the South Pavilion, became his temporary home, one room, 20 feet square, set at the southern end of what would eventually become the house's great terraced wing. He slept in it, ate in it, worked in it, received guests in it. It was not inconvenient for him. He was building something, and the smallness of the present moment was simply part of the process. He would not stop building for 50 years. Monticello, as the world has come to know it, is a neoclassical masterpiece, the domed house, the elegant facade, the long terraces that extend from either side of the central structure like arms reaching across the hillside. But it was never finished, not really. Jefferson was always revising it, tearing down walls and building them again differently, adding skylights, changing staircases, redesigning the entrance. He owned a set of architectural instruments that he used himself, and he drew plans compulsively, late at night, in the quiet hours when the house had settled into silence. The building was important. But what he was always most passionate about was not the building at all. It was the ground around it. The gardens. The orchards. The vegetable terraces cut into the southeastern slope of the mountain. The flower beds that curved and looped around the house. The groves and walks that wound through the forest. The experimental plots where he tested seeds from 3 continents. The plants that arrived by ship and post rider and personal messenger from correspondents all over the world. The gardens of Monticello were not decorative. They were not a wealthy man's hobby or a gentleman's indulgence. They were, and this is something worth understanding slowly, in the quiet, they were where Jefferson actually thought. Where he actually was most himself. Before we follow him there, it helps to understand what the world was in which he was doing this gardening. What America was. What Virginia was. What it meant, in the 18th century, for a man of education and ambition to stand on a hilltop and decide to spend his life making something grow. Part 2: The World of the Planter and the Philosopher. Imagine the smell of tobacco in late summer. Not the processed smell, the clean, green, slightly narcotic smell of living tobacco plants in August heat. The broad leaves catching the sun, the sticky residue on everything that touches them, the faint sweetness in the air as the plants ripen. For a Virginia planter of the 18th century, that smell meant money. It meant survival. It meant everything. Virginia's colonial economy was built almost entirely on tobacco. The crop shaped the landscape, fields cleared of forest, soil depleted after only a few seasons, planters constantly needing new land as the old wore out. It shaped the labor system. Tobacco cultivation was labor-intensive, and the demand for workers had driven the expansion of enslaved African labor through the 17th and 18th centuries until, by the time Jefferson was born, slavery was the structural foundation of everything in the Virginia plantation world. Jefferson inherited land, and he inherited enslaved people. His father left him about 5,000 acres and roughly 22 enslaved individuals when he died in 1757. Over the course of his life, Jefferson would hold legal ownership over more than 600 people. It is the central fact of his biography that cannot be softened or set aside, and it runs through the story of Monticello's gardens in ways that are immediate and concrete because those gardens were built by enslaved labor, maintained by enslaved labor, and surrounded by a plantation system whose economic reality Jefferson both depended upon and, in his private writings, occasionally expressed discomfort with. We will talk more about this as we go. It is not a sidebar to the story of his gardens. It is woven into every path, every planting, every record. But alongside the planter's world, Jefferson was also forming himself as a scholar, and the intellectual climate of the 1760s and 1770s was one of the most extraordinary in Western history. The Enlightenment was at its height. Newton had changed the way educated people understood the physical universe. Locke had changed the way they understood government and the rights of the individual. Linnaeus had published his great taxonomic system for classifying living things, bringing order and language to the chaos of the natural world. Buffon in France was writing his multi-volume Natural History of the Earth, attempting to describe and categorize every creature and plant on the planet. For Jefferson, the Enlightenment was not an abstract political philosophy. It was a way of seeing everything. It meant that the world, all of it, including the soil under your feet and the plants growing in it, was knowable, measurable, improvable. If you paid careful enough attention, if you kept good enough records, if you experimented methodically and compared your results with others doing the same thing elsewhere, you could understand nature. You could improve on it. You could participate in the great project of human knowledge. This is why Jefferson kept a garden book. He began it in 1766, when he was 22 years old, with a single entry, March 30th. Purple hyacinth begins to bloom. That's it. That is the entire entry for that day. A note about a flower. And then, for 58 years, he continued recording planting dates, frost dates, what bloomed when, what failed, what thrived, how many days from sowing to harvest, what varieties performed best, what the soil needed. His garden book runs to several hundred pages. It is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of American gardening, and it is also, if you read it with the right kind of attention, a kind of autobiography, a record of a man's inner life as told through the seasons of his garden. He was also forming himself as a political thinker. Of course, the years of the 1760s and 1770s were the years of colonial protest and eventual revolution, and Jefferson was in the middle of all of it. The Stamp Act, the Townsend Duties, the Boston Massacre, the slowly escalating conflict with Britain. He was reading, arguing, writing, attending the Virginia legislature, thinking constantly about government and liberty and the proper relationship between rulers and the governed. What is interesting, in retrospect, is that even during the most politically consuming years of his life, the writing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the years of the Revolution, the chaotic period of American state building, even then, he was thinking about his garden. Writing home from Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, in the same weeks when he was drafting the most famous document in American history, he was asking for updates on the planting at Monticello. How were the peas doing? Had the asparagus come up? What was the state of the young peach trees? The garden was always there, underneath everything else. A constant. Jefferson's formal education had been excellent by colonial standards. He had studied at the College of William and Mary under the remarkable George Wythe, who taught him law but also taught him, perhaps more importantly, how to think rigorously, how to read primary sources, how to ask questions that didn't yet have answers. Jefferson read voraciously and eclectically Roman history, English common law, Greek philosophy, French literature, botanical treatises, architectural theory, agricultural science, natural history. He read in 4 languages with ease and in several more with effort. His personal library, which he eventually sold to Congress to form the nucleus of the Library of Congress, contained nearly 6,500 volumes, an extraordinary collection for its time and place. But for all his reading, Jefferson was also deeply, fundamentally a person of practice. He did not just read about gardening. He gardened. He did not just read about architecture. He designed. He did not just read about science. He experimented. His hands were in the soil. His measurements were taken with instruments he carried himself. His observations were his own. This combination, the scholar's range and the farmer's hands, is what made the gardens at Monticello something different from most 18th-century gentlemen's gardens. They were not just beautiful. They were not just demonstrations of wealth and taste. They were, in the deepest sense, a lifetime experiment. A laboratory. A library made of living things. He was 26 years old when he began the real work of laying out those gardens. By then, the summit had been leveled, the first building was going up, and the question of what to do with all that hilltop land, the slopes, the terraces, the open ground around the house, was becoming urgent. He had ideas. He had been keeping notes. He had been reading the great English and French garden writers, and he had been watching, every spring and summer and fall, what the mountain itself wanted to do. What came next would take the rest of his life to unfold. Part 3: The Vegetable Garden and the Art of Growing Food. On the southeastern slope of Monticello's mountain, cut into the hillside like a long green shelf, there is a kitchen garden unlike any other in early America. It is 1,000 feet long and 80 feet wide, nearly 2 acres of level ground suspended above a steep wooded slope, held in place by a stone retaining wall that runs the full length of its lower edge. From a distance, it looks almost architectural. From inside it, standing among the rows with the mountain falling away below you and the Blue Ridge in the distance, It feels like being on the deck of a ship, level and purposeful, surrounded by vastness. Jefferson called it the garden. Visitors called it extraordinary. He spent decades of his life there, early in the mornings before the heat came up, moving through the rows with a basket or a notebook or both. He grew nearly 300 varieties of vegetables, herbs, and fruits on that long terrace. Not 300 plants, 300 varieties. 23 types of peas. 15 types of lettuce. Endive, broccoli, sea kale, salsify, Jerusalem artichokes, artichokes from France, peppers from Mexico, sweet potatoes, okra, eggplant, beets of multiple colors, celeriac, rutabaga, broad beans, snap beans, French beans, Egyptian onions, and dozens of other things for which some required searching of 18th-century seed catalogs and botanical correspondence. The peas deserve particular attention. Jefferson's passion for peas bordered on the obsessive, in the most endearing possible way. He grew at least 30 varieties over the course of his gardening life: early peas, late peas, Dutch peas, marrowfat peas, sugar snap peas, varieties obtained from seeds sent by friends, varieties brought back from France, varieties developed by his own selection over years of careful growing. He planted them early and often, noting in his garden book the exact date of each first harvest, tracking which variety came in first, which yielded best, which had the finest flavor. There was a tradition in Albemarle County, perhaps apocryphal, but widely believed and often repeated, of a competition among neighboring planters to see who could bring the first dish of peas to the table each spring. The winner hosted a dinner for the others, and the pride of being first was genuinely felt. Jefferson, despite having arguably the finest kitchen garden in the county, reportedly almost never won this contest. His neighbor George Divers, who farmed in the warmer lowlands and had the advantage of earlier soil temperatures, usually beat him to it. The story goes that when Jefferson did finally win one year, he refrained from announcing his victory out of deference to Divers, not wanting his neighbor to be embarrassed. It is a small story. But it is one of those small stories that tells you something true about a person. Here was a man who had written the Declaration of Independence, served as governor of Virginia, ambassador to France, secretary of state, vice president, and president, and who genuinely, warmly cared about being the first person to harvest peas in the spring. The garden was not just for pleasure, of course. It was also the primary source of vegetables for the house, a complicated household that could include not just Jefferson himself and his enslaved workforce, but visiting family members. Jefferson's daughter Martha lived nearby and visited constantly with her large family, political colleagues, scientific correspondents, and the steady stream of visitors who arrived at Monticello from everywhere and were almost never turned away. Jefferson was famous for his table. Meals at Monticello were described by visitors with consistent admiration: the variety of vegetables, the quality of the bread, the wine chosen with care, the macaroni that Jefferson had encountered in France and become devoted to, the vanilla ice cream that his cook James Hemings had learned to make in Paris and which was a revelation to most American guests who tasted it. The kitchen garden fed all of this. James Hemings himself deserves applause here. Why did Hemings return? We don't know his private thoughts. We know that Jefferson promised to free him after he had trained a successor, a promise that was eventually fulfilled, in 1796, when Hemings was granted his freedom. But we know also that Hemings had family at Monticello, including his sister Sally, and that the decision to return must have been weighted with all the complexity of a life that was never entirely his own. The food that Jefferson grew and that James Hemings and, later, other enslaved cooks prepared, food that visitors praised as some of the finest in America, was the product of a collaboration that was never named as such. Jefferson recorded the garden. He recorded what he planted and when. He did not record, in any systematic way, the labor that made his garden possible, the names and hours of the men and women who dug, planted, weeded, watered, harvested, and preserved everything that grew there. We know some of their names from other records. Wormley Hughes, who was one of Jefferson's most trusted gardeners, a man who was buried on the mountain and who, according to family tradition, helped dig Jefferson's grave. Goliath, who managed the garden's heavy work. The women who managed the kitchen garden's harvesting in season. These are not footnotes to the story of Jefferson's gardening. They are its foundation. The vegetable garden was organized with the same taxonomic enthusiasm that Jefferson brought to everything. He divided it into what he called squares, numbered plots, each devoted to a particular category of vegetable. The categories were organized according to which part of the plant was eaten: fruits, tomatoes, beans, squash, roots, carrots, beets, radishes, and leaves, lettuce, cabbage, herbs. It was a living version of Linnaeus's classification system, arranged on a hillside in Virginia. He experimented constantly. He obtained seeds from sources all over the world, from friends in Europe, from botanical gardens, from the Lewis and Clark expedition, which he had organized partly as a scientific survey of North American plant species, from Native American sources, from West Africa via correspondents who understood that the crops brought by enslaved Africans, okra, black-eyed peas, sesame, sorghum, were nutritionally important and worth cultivating. He tested multiple varieties of the same vegetable side by side, noting which performed better in Monticello's particular conditions: the elevation, the clay-heavy soil, the late spring frosts that could catch the unwary. He was, in other words, doing what we would now call varietal trials. What the modern agricultural research station does with government funding and scientific infrastructure, Jefferson was doing on his own hillside, with his own hands and those of the people who worked for him, funded by a personal fortune that was always, in truth, less secure than it appeared. One of the things that strikes a reader of his garden book is the combination of precision and passion. The entries are often brief: a date, a plant name, a note about the weather or the harvest. But occasionally something more personal breaks through. A note about the extraordinary beauty of a particular blossom. A remark about the pleasure of a certain variety of being eaten young and tender. A quiet record of a failure, a crop that didn't germinate, a frost that killed the seedlings, written without drama, because the garden had already taught him that failure was simply part of the cycle, and that the only response was to plant again next year. The vegetable garden at Monticello as it exists today has been largely restored to its 18th century appearance by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, using Jefferson's garden book and archaeological evidence. Visitors can walk the long terrace and see the numbered squares and the varieties that Jefferson grew, labeled with their period names. It is one of the most remarkable living historical documents in America, a garden that is also an argument about what attention and care can do. But the vegetable garden was only one part of what Jefferson was building on his mountain. To the west of the house, something quite different was taking shape. Something wilder and more personal. Something he called, with characteristic understatement, his grove. Part 4: The Grove and the Garden in the English Style. Picture the light in a forest on a summer morning. Not bright light, filtered light. The kind that moves as the leaves move, shifting and dappling, making the ground below seem almost aqueous, as though you were at the bottom of something and the world above was flowing. The shadows are cool even when the day is warm. The air smells of decay and growth at the same time, leaf mold and green sap, the old and the new always mingled. Jefferson loved this kind of light. He loved forests, and he loved what the English garden theorists of the 18th century were calling the natural style, the idea that a garden should not announce itself as a garden, should not impose rigid geometric patterns on the landscape, but should instead follow and enhance the natural forms of the land, opening views here and drawing them closed there, creating surprise and contemplation in equal measure. The English landscape garden tradition, represented by designers like Lancelot Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, and theorized by writers like Horace Walpole and Alexander Pope, was, by the 1770s and 1780s, the dominant aesthetic in European garden design. It had largely displaced the formal French and Dutch styles of the previous century, with their clipped hedges and geometric parterres, in favor of something that looked more like nature herself had arranged it: rolling lawns, serpentine paths, carefully placed groves of trees, water features that mimicked natural streams and lakes. Jefferson encountered this tradition fully when he traveled in England in 1786, during his time as American minister in Paris. He spent several weeks touring the great English gardens Stowe, Blenheim, Woburn, Painshill, Chiswick with his friend John Adams, who was serving as American minister in London. Jefferson kept detailed notes, recording the plants, the paths, the views, the approximate acreage of each garden, the effects he admired and those he found excessive. He was not, he wrote, a man who thought a garden should merely astonish. He wanted it to make you think. To make you feel, in the quiet and particular way that nature makes you feel when you are paying attention. He returned to Virginia with English garden books tucked into his luggage and a vision for what Monticello's grounds could become. Over the following years and decades, he developed a plan for the area west and north of the house that drew on what he had seen in England while adapting it to the specific character of his Virginia mountain. He called the area the Grove, and it was conceived as a kind of managed wildness, the existing forest thinned and opened, the understory cleared to allow views through the trees, winding walks laid out that led from the house through the woods and back again, with carefully chosen stopping points where the view opened or the light changed or a particular tree was worth pausing to consider. He wanted, as he put it, a shrubbery, groups of flowering shrubs and small ornamental trees planted among the native forest in naturalistic clusters, so that in spring and summer the woods would be brightened by bloom. The plants he chose for this were partly native and partly exotic. He was deeply interested in American native plants. This was, in part, a political interest as well as an aesthetic one. European naturalists like the Comte de Buffon had argued, notoriously, that the New World was naturally inferior to the Old, that its animals were smaller and less vigorous, its plants less fine, its soil less productive. This argument was both scientifically wrong and deeply offensive to American national pride, and Jefferson took it as a personal challenge. In his only published book, Notes on the State of Virginia, written in the early 1780s, he systematically refuted Buffon's claims, cataloging Virginia's natural abundance, the size and vigor of its fauna, the richness of its flora. The garden at Monticello was, among other things, a living rebuttal to Buffon, proof that the American land was not inferior, that it was in fact extraordinary, and that it only needed cultivation and attention to reveal its full depth. So the grove was planted with American magnolias, both the great southern magnolia, with its enormous glossy leaves and white flowers that smell of lemon and cream, and the cucumber magnolia and the umbrella magnolia, both with their great tropical-looking blooms. He planted native crabapples and wild plums, dogwoods and redbuds that in early spring turned the forest edge into a wash of white and pink. He planted native azaleas and mountain laurel and, in the shadier spots, spicebush and sweet shrub. But he also planted exotics, plants brought from Europe, from Asia, from other parts of America that didn't grow naturally in Virginia. Calycanthus from the Carolinas. Mimosa from the Mediterranean, which Jefferson loved for its feathery pink flowers and its curious sensitivity, the leaves folded up when you touched them, a trick that delighted him and his grandchildren both. Paper mulberry from Asia. Paulownia, the empress tree, which he was among the first people to grow in America. The walks through the grove were designed to be walked slowly, in the late afternoon or the early morning, when the light came at an angle and the shadows were long. Jefferson laid out three main walks: the upper road, which ran around the perimeter of the mountaintop, the middle road, and the lower road, which dropped into the cooler woods below the house. Each was different in character. Each offered different views, different light, different associations. He was very particular about his walks. He walked every day, in all weather, for most of his life. His personal physician Thomas Cooper observed that Jefferson walked as much as 10 to 15 miles a day during periods of intense intellectual work, as though the movement of the body was necessary for the movement of the mind. At Monticello, the walks through the grove were part of this rhythm. They were not recreation in the way we use that word, slightly apologetically. They were work. Among the things he thought about as he walked was the relationship between place and feeling, something that the English garden theorists called association. The idea that a garden could be designed not just to please the eye but to provoke particular emotions and trains of thought, through the choice of plants, the arrangement of views, the naming of places. The great English gardens had temples and ruins and inscriptions. Jefferson, with characteristic American Republican austerity, resisted most of this, though not entirely. There are hints in his notes of intentions that never quite materialized: a grotto, perhaps, in the hillside. A small building in the woods. An inscription carved into a stone near a spring. What did materialize was something simpler and in many ways more powerful. The relationship between the house and its landscape, the way Monticello sits on its mountain not as a fortification or a monument but as a habitation, a place where human life and the natural world have been brought into a long, careful conversation. That relationship is the deepest achievement of Jefferson's garden work. It took decades to develop, and it was never fully finished, and that incompleteness is itself part of what makes it feel alive. As we move forward through the seasons of Jefferson's life, we will find the garden changing with him, reflecting the years of his public life, the long absences, the periods of neglect and renewal, and finally, in his retirement, the great sustained effort to bring it all to completion before the end. Part 5: France, Flowerbeds, and the Gardens That Changed Him. In the late summer of 1784, Thomas Jefferson sailed for France. He was 41 years old. He had recently lost his wife, Martha Wales Jefferson, who had died in September 1782 after a long illness following the birth of their sixth child. By accounts of those who knew him, Jefferson was devastated, so utterly undone by her death that his surviving daughters, Patsy and Polly, and the people who worked in the house at Monticello, feared for some time that he might not recover. He rode for hours alone in the countryside around Monticello, unable to eat, unable to work. The grief was total. The appointment to France, to serve first as a trade commissioner and then as the American minister to the French court, came at a moment when getting away from Monticello may have been as necessary as the diplomatic assignment itself. He packed his books, his scientific instruments, and his eldest daughter Patsy, who was 12, and he sailed across the Atlantic into a world that would change him permanently. Paris in the 1780s was the center of everything that Jefferson cared about. The Enlightenment was in full flower, and he meant that literally as well as figuratively. The great botanical garden, the Jardin du Roi, later the Jardin des Plantes, was one of the finest in the world. The gardens of Versailles, of Chantilly, of the Trianon, the grand formal gardens of the French court, were being transformed in real time by the new natural style, and the debate between the old formal aesthetics and the new romantic naturalism was alive and contested in the salons and garden journals of the city. Jefferson went to see all of it. He visited gardens the way other people visited cathedrals, with reverence, careful attention, and extensive notes. In the Paris Botanical Garden, he spent hours studying the plant collections, talking with the botanists and gardeners, requesting seeds and cuttings to send back to America. He corresponded with gardeners in England, in Italy, in Holland, requesting seeds and bulbs and starts. He shipped plants home to Monticello in care of his overseer, though many did not survive the long ocean crossing. But it was the flower gardens of France that may have left the deepest mark on his imagination. The French were extraordinary flower growers. In the formal gardens of the Trianon and in the more intimate kitchen gardens of private houses, flowers were grown with an intensity and variety that Jefferson had not encountered before. Tulips from Turkey. Hyacinths from Holland. Roses in dozens of varieties, trained on walls and arching over paths. Camellias and oleanders in pots that were brought inside for winter. Hardy perennials, peonies, irises, phlox, larkspur massed in long borders against stone walls. When Jefferson returned to America in 1789, he brought flower seeds and bulbs packed in boxes and wrapped in oilcloth, labeled in his precise handwriting with plant names in both English and French. He had intentions for Monticello's flower gardens that would take years to realize, but the vision was fixed. The flower gardens at Monticello, the oval beds and the long winding borders near the house, are in some ways the most intimate expression of Jefferson's gardening. They were personal in a way that the vegetable garden, with its taxonomic organization and its practical purpose, was not quite. They were for beauty. They were for the pleasure of color and fragrance on a morning walk or an evening sit on the house's famous west terrace. He laid out a series of oval flower beds along the approach to the house from the west, what is called the west lawn. These oval beds were planted with a mixture of annuals and bulbs, changed with the seasons, always presenting something in bloom from the earliest spring tulips through the late autumn chrysanthemums. He was meticulous about succession, planning the plantings so that as one thing faded, another came forward, the display never quite collapsing into brownness. He grew sweet williams in stocks, whose fragrance on warm evenings carries remarkable distances. He grew larkspur in the blues and purples he particularly favored. He grew Nicotiana, ornamental tobacco, grown for its white flowers and intense night fragrance rather than for curing. He grew climbing roses on the house's south face, and sweet peas against the fence of the vegetable garden, and, along the stone wall of the roundabout below the house, a long planting of tulips that bloomed in April and turned the hillside into something that visitors stopped and stared at. France also changed Jefferson's understanding of what could be grown. The climate of the French Midi, the warm South, was not unlike parts of Virginia, and the plants that grew there planted ideas in his mind. He became obsessed with the possibility of growing wine grapes at Monticello, a project that, as we will see, occupied him for decades without ever quite succeeding as he hoped. But perhaps the most significant thing that France changed was something less concrete. Jefferson came back from Europe with a heightened sense of the garden as a place of political and philosophical meaning, a space where values could be expressed as much as utility could be achieved. The English and French garden theorists he had been reading took this seriously, and the gardens he had visited in England and France were full of this kind of intentionality. For Jefferson, in his particular historical moment, a garden designed along natural principles rather than artificial formal ones had a kind of democratic resonance. The straight-line formality of Versailles was the garden of monarchy, imposing, hierarchical, asserting the human will over nature in a show of absolute power. The naturalistic garden, with its winding paths and its respect for the existing landscape, suggested something different. Not the conquest of nature, but a conversation with it. Not the imposition of order, but the discovery of an order that was already there. This was not merely aesthetic preference. For a man who had written that all men were created equal, and who was trying, however imperfectly, however contradictorily, to imagine what a new republic's culture and landscape should look like, the choice of how to design a garden was a meaningful one. He came home from France in September 1789. America was changing, the new Constitution had been ratified, Washington had been inaugurated, the new government was taking shape in New York and then Philadelphia. Jefferson was about to become Secretary of State. The public life that would consume him for the next decade and a half was just beginning. But the garden was waiting for him on the mountain. And he had brought it so many things. Part 6, The Vineyard, the Orchard, and the Taste of Something New. Think for a moment about what it means to plant a tree. Not a small plant, not something that will come back next spring from a seed you pressed into the soil this fall. A tree. Something that will take years to establish, years more to reach its full size, decades to achieve the majestic presence of maturity. When you plant a tree, you are making a bet on the future. You are saying, perhaps not in words, but in the act itself, that you believe the future will come. That you will be here, or that something of you will be here, to see it. Jefferson planted orchards. Not one orchard, but several, on different aspects of the mountain, at different elevations, for different purposes. The main orchard, the North Orchard, eventually contained more than 1,000 trees, apples in dozens of varieties, pears, quinces, cherries, apricots, nectarines, figs, and almonds. The South Orchard held still more fruit trees, and also the vineyard that Jefferson hoped, always hoped, would one day produce wine worthy of what he had drunk in France. The wine project was one of the great sustained optimisms of his life. Jefferson loved wine with the same intensity and specificity that he brought to everything. He had come to know French wine during his years in Paris, not casually but deeply, the way a scholar comes to know a subject. He knew the great chateaux of Bordeaux, the vineyards of Burgundy, the different soils and microclimates that produced different characters. He kept detailed notes on what he drank and where, with the same precision he applied to plant varieties in his garden book. He served fine wine at Monticello and at his presidential table in Washington, and he spent amounts on wine that his already strained finances could not easily bear. But what he truly wanted was to grow wine grapes in America. To prove that the Virginia climate and soil could support viticulture, wine growing, and thereby provide Americans with a wholesome, affordable domestic wine that would reduce the dependence on imported spirits, which he associated, with perhaps more hope than evidence, with the poverty and social disorder of the lower classes. This was both idealistic and practical, which is to say it was thoroughly Jeffersonian. The challenge was the grapes. European wine grapes, the Vitis spinifera varieties that produced Bordeaux and Burgundy, were famously difficult to grow in America. Something always killed them: the fungal diseases of the humid eastern summers, the phylloxera root louse, the late spring frosts, the dry autumns. Jefferson tried multiple times, obtaining vines from Italy, from Spain, from France, from German contacts who assured him that their particular variety would survive the Virginia climate. He planted and replanted the vineyard on the south slope below the house, tending it with care, watching it fail, and beginning again. He also experimented with Native American grape varieties, the Vitis labrusca, the fox grape, the muscadine, which were disease-resistant and cold-hardy but produced wines with a characteristic flavor that wine drinkers trained on European wines found peculiar. The term foxy was used a musky, animal quality in the wine that was not objectionable if you had grown up with it, but jarring if you had not. Jefferson noted the difference and was not entirely satisfied. He brought in a skilled Italian viticulturalist, Philip Mazzi, to oversee grape growing at Monticello in the 1770s. Mazzi was an extraordinary figure, a Tuscan farmer, physician, merchant, and eventually revolutionary, who became Jefferson's friend and neighbor and who for several years managed an experimental vineyard and farm on land adjacent to Monticello. Mazzi brought Italian vine cuttings, Italian winemaking expertise, and a belief that the Virginia Piedmont, with its warm summers and well-drained soils, could be wine country. The vineyard they established together was promising for a time. But the Revolution interrupted everything. Mazzi eventually left Virginia for good, and the vineyard declined without him. Jefferson never entirely gave up on the wine project. Even in his final years at Monticello, he was corresponding with Italian and Spanish contacts about obtaining hardy wine varieties, testing new plots, noting the microclimate differences between various parts of the mountain. He was right, as it turned out, about the potential. Virginia is today a significant wine-producing region. Jefferson country wines are a real and growing thing, and the land he was farming produces good wine grapes now, with better rootstocks and disease-resistant varieties that weren't available to him. He would have found this satisfying, one imagines. The orchards, unlike the vineyard, were an unqualified success. Jefferson kept detailed records of his orchard trees, their sources, their planting dates, their first fruiting, the quality and flavor of their fruit. He was particularly devoted to certain apple varieties. The Newtown Pippin, which he regarded as one of the finest apples in existence. The Asopa Spitzenberg, a crisp and aromatic apple from New York State that he obtained from his friend and successor as president, James Madison, whose estate at Montpelier was not far away. The Hughes crab, a small, tart Virginia apple that made an extraordinary hard cider, at a time when cider was the everyday drink of the American countryside. He pressed cider every fall, hundreds of gallons, stored in the cellar beneath the house, which was cool enough to keep it drinkable through the following summer. He also grew peaches in great quantities, and the peach brandy made at Monticello was locally famous, a clear, fragrant spirit that Jefferson distributed to friends and family and regarded with considerable pride. The peach trees deserved their own moment of attention. Jefferson was devoted to them. He grew dozens of varieties and replaced them constantly, since peach trees are relatively short-lived. He noted which varieties came in earliest, which had the sweetest flesh, which held up best for preserving. He ate fresh peaches when they were in season with the uncomplicated pleasure of someone who had waited all year for exactly this, the warmth of the fruit in the hand, the skin giving way, the juice. There is a letter from Jefferson to his friend and former secretary William Short, written when Jefferson was in his late 70s, in which he describes a morning walk through the orchard. He writes about the light coming through the apple trees, about the smell of ripe fruit on the ground, about the satisfaction of seeing a tree he had planted decades before now fully grown and laden. He doesn't make anything grand of it. He just describes it, with the simple directness of someone reporting something genuinely fine. The orchards were also, like everything else at Monticello, works of deliberate organization and planning. Jefferson laid out the trees in rows, kept records of each tree's variety and position, noted when individual trees died and what replaced them. He corresponded with the great nurseryman of his day, William Prince of Long Island, who ran the most important nursery in early America, and through whom Jefferson obtained some of his finest fruit varieties. He shared his own varieties with others, sending apple scions and peach stones and grape cuttings to friends around the country, contributing to the great distribution of plant material that characterized the early American agricultural world. This generosity with plant material was something Jefferson practiced throughout his life. He believed profoundly that the improvement of American agriculture was a collective project, that knowledge about better crops, better methods, better varieties should circulate freely, and that hoarding agricultural knowledge was a kind of theft from the public good. He shared seeds and information with anyone who asked, and he received the same in return from a wide network of correspondents whose exchanges enriched every garden they touched. As the seasons passed and the orchard trees grew tall and the vegetable garden filled with its dozens of varieties and the grove opened with bloom each spring, Monticello was becoming something that had never existed before in America. A garden that was also a laboratory. A farm that was also a library. A hilltop that was one man's lifelong attempt to understand what it meant to belong to the earth. Part 7. The Presidency and the Longing for Home. In the winter of 1801, Thomas Jefferson moved into the White House. He was 57 years old. He had spent most of the previous decade in public service, Secretary of State under Washington, Vice President under Adams, and the election of 1800 had been one of the most contested and contentious in American history. The battle between Jefferson and John Adams had been bitter, personal, and damaging to both men, and the strange constitutional anomaly that gave Jefferson and Aaron Burr the same number of electoral votes and threw the election into the House of Representatives had added weeks of anxiety to an already grueling process. He arrived in Washington, a city that was still more in tension than reality, its grand Baroque street plan laid out over muddy fields and half-built structures, and set about being president with the same systematic energy he brought to everything. But from the moment he arrived, he was writing home to Monticello. The letters from this period are among the most revealing in Jefferson's enormous correspondence. They are addressed primarily to his son-in-law Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. and to the overseers at Monticello, and they deal, with extraordinary detail and consistency, with the garden. What should be planted this spring? Which peas should go in first? Whether the asparagus bed had recovered from the previous autumn's neglect? Whether the young mulberry trees had been pruned? What the state of the peach crop looked like? From a distance of 200 miles, Jefferson was trying to run his garden. And the gap between what he was doing in Washington, presiding over the new nation, managing the Louisiana Purchase, overseeing the Lewis and Clark expedition, receiving foreign ministers, negotiating with the Barbary Coast states, and what he was thinking about in his private hours, which was the garden, is one of the most humanly interesting aspects of his biography. He hated Washington. Not in a way he expressed publicly, not in a way that impeded his effectiveness as president, but personally, privately, with a consistent and undisguised longing for home. The city was unfinished and uncomfortable. The social obligations of the presidency were exhausting. He missed the quiet of Monticello, the morning walks, the smell of turned earth, the particular quality of light on the Blue Ridge that you could only see from one place on earth. He returned to Monticello as often as he could, more often than any previous president, his political enemies noted, in tones of criticism that he ignored. He went home for weeks in the summer, in the spring, whenever the press of Washington business permitted, and sometimes when it didn't quite. The garden was the reason, or part of it. He needed to be in it. When he was in Washington, he gardened there too, in a modest way, given the constraints of the executive mansion's grounds. He planted kitchen herbs in boxes near the kitchen wing. He arranged for garden beds to be dug near the house. He corresponded with the city's nurseries and with the gardeners of the diplomatic corps, who sometimes had interesting exotic plants. He brought seeds back to Washington from Monticello and planted them in pots on the window ledges of his office. There is something both touching and slightly absurd about this, the most powerful man in America growing plants in pots on his office windowsill. But it also reveals something essential. The garden was not a retreat for Jefferson, not in the sense of an escape from reality into comfort. It was, rather, a kind of anchor. The thing that kept him oriented. The practice that reminded him who he was, what he cared about, what was real. The presidency lasted 8 years, 2 full terms, 1801 to 1809, and by the end of it, Jefferson was exhausted and eager to be done. He was 65 years old when he left office, and while he was in good health and would live another 17 years, he was ready for the last chapter. Ready to go home. Ready, as he put it in a letter to a friend, to put down the harness and return to the farm. What he was returning to was a garden that had suffered from his absences. The overseers he had left in charge were competent men but not gardeners of Jefferson's intensity and knowledge, and the plantings had been maintained imperfectly, some sections growing wild, others neglected. The vegetable garden needed extensive work. The orchards needed pruning and replacement of dead trees. The grove had encroached back toward wildness in the areas he had most carefully tended. He was not discouraged by this. He was, if anything, energized. He had 17 years left, and he intended to use them. And there were people there who knew him that way, who saw him early in the morning before the public face was fully on, who worked alongside him in the rows and the paths, who knew his habits and his preferences and the particular way he walked when he was thinking hard about something. Those people were, in large part, the enslaved community of Monticello. They saw more of the private Jefferson than almost anyone else in his life. And their presence in the garden, their knowledge of it, their labor in it, all of that was part of what made the garden what it was. As we move into the great final chapter of Jefferson's life, the retirement at Monticello, we will find the garden at its most complex and its most beautiful. And we will find Jefferson at his most fully himself. Part 8, The Enslaved Community and the Garden They Built. There is a name worth pausing on. Wormley Hughes. He was born at Monticello around 1781. The son of an enslaved woman named Ursula and an enslaved man named George, who was Jefferson's personal body servant for many years. Wormley grew up on the mountain. He learned to garden there, not from books, though perhaps the books were occasionally consulted on his behalf, but from years of direct experience, from observation, from the inherited knowledge of people who had been working that particular soil for decades. By the time Jefferson returned from the presidency in 1809, Wormley Hughes had become one of the most skilled and trusted gardeners at Monticello. He managed the practical work of the vegetable garden and the grounds. He knew which spots on the mountain drained well and which stayed wet, which beds needed more compost, which trees were struggling and why. He propagated plants from cuttings and divisions with practiced confidence. He was the person who actually kept the garden alive through the long winters and the hot Augusts and the dry falls when the water had to be carried up the hill. Jefferson's garden book records what was planted and when. It does not record who did the planting. It does not record the daily labor that sustained the garden through all its seasons, the weeding, the watering, the staking of climbing plants, the harvesting, the composting, the repairing of paths and walls after heavy rains. That labor was done by Wormley Hughes and by the other enslaved workers at Monticello, most of whose individual contributions to the garden are invisible in the documentary record. We know some of their names from lists that Jefferson kept, lists of enslaved people at Monticello that appear at various points in his records, typically in the context of accounting for labor or provisions. We know names, sometimes ages, sometimes family relationships. What we rarely know, and what the historical record largely fails to preserve, is anything of their inner lives, their thoughts about the work, their feelings about the garden, what they made of tending something beautiful under conditions of unfreedom. This silence is itself a form of historical record. It tells us something about the choices of the people who kept the records, what they thought was worth writing down, whose perspective was worth preserving. It was not a neutral omission. What we can say is that the enslaved community at Monticello was not simply a labor force. They were people with their own families, their own skills, their own forms of knowledge, their own gardens. Enslaved workers at Monticello, like enslaved workers on many plantations, were typically allowed small plots of land, sometimes called garden plots or patches, where they could grow their own food, beyond the provisions that the plantation provided. These gardens were not the grand scientific enterprise of Jefferson's vegetable terraces. They were practical, intensely productive, and full of plants that connected their growers to African and African American food traditions. Okra grew in those gardens. Cowpeas, which we call black-eyed peas. Sweet potatoes, which had been cultivated in Africa and brought across the Atlantic in the terrible passage of the slave trade. Collard greens, sorghum, sesame, a plant called benny in the Gullah tradition, and many other things that did not appear in Jefferson's formal plantings but that were part of the living knowledge of the people who lived on the mountain. Some of these plants, over time, moved from the enslaved community's gardens into the main vegetable garden and onto the Monticello table. Jefferson grew sesame, which he called benny, using the word he had heard from the enslaved community, in his garden beds, and he experimented with it as a cooking oil. He grew okra and recorded it carefully. The exchange of plant knowledge between the enslaved community and the planter's household moved in both directions, as it usually does when people live in close daily proximity. The women of the enslaved community are worth particular attention here. They were largely responsible for the processing and preservation of the garden's harvest, drying herbs, putting up pickles, making preserves, drying and storing beans and seeds for next year's planting. This work required knowledge of timing, technique, and materials that was passed down within the community through practice and instruction rather than through written records. It was expert work, done invisibly, and it was what made the garden's abundance usable through the long winter months. The enslaved children of Monticello also moved through the garden. Jefferson's grandchildren played in the vegetable beds and the flower gardens, and the children of the enslaved community played alongside them in those early years before the world made its full distinctions felt. There are accounts in family letters of children helping in the garden, of Jefferson teaching his grandchildren to identify plants, of the shared pleasure of something coming up from a seed you had put in the ground. But the separation was always there, and it was absolute. Jefferson's grandchildren would grow up to be free, educated, propertied. The children of the enslaved community would be enslaved, as their parents were, and their grandparents before them. The garden they grew up in, the soil they worked, the trees they planted, none of it would be theirs. Not legally, not in any way that the law recognized. Jefferson wrote, in the notes on the state of Virginia and in private letters, about slavery with what reads, in the historical record, as genuine moral distress. He called it a moral and political depravity. He worried about what it was doing to the nation, to its values, to the character of the master class. He wrote, in one of his most famous passages, that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just. And yet he did not free the people who worked his land. He freed a handful, over the course of his life, James Hemings in 1796, and 5 others in his will, including Burwell Colbert, his butler, and John Hemings, his master carpenter and joiner, and Joseph Fawcett and Eston Hemings. The roughly 130 people still enslaved at Monticello at the time of his death in 1826 were sold at auction to pay his enormous debts. This is the weight that sits underneath the beauty of Monticello's gardens. It does not cancel the beauty, but it gives it a different quality, something more complex, more morally charged, more honestly representative of the nation that Jefferson himself helped to imagine and whose contradictions he embodied. The garden was built by many hands. It was imagined by one man. And the relationship between those two facts is the most important thing you can understand about it. Part 9: The Retirement Years and the Great Garden in Full Flower. March of 1809. Jefferson rode home from Washington for the last time as president, on horseback because he preferred it, through the late winter Virginia landscape, the bare trees, the cold fields, the red clay roads still frozen in the morning and muddy by afternoon. He arrived at Monticello to find it familiar and changed, as places always are after long absence. The house was being worked on, it was always being worked on. The gardens needed attention. The orchards needed pruning. The terrace wall had slumped in one section from frost damage and needed rebuilding. He was 65 years old, in good health, his mind as sharp as it had ever been, and he had, by his own account, no intention of writing another political letter for the rest of his life. He intended to garden. What followed were, by many measures, the richest years of Monticello's garden history. Jefferson was finally present, not writing from Washington, not planning from a distance, not sending instructions through intermediaries. He was there, in the garden, every morning, with his notebook and his basket, paying the sustained and patient attention that a garden of this complexity demanded. The vegetable terrace was expanded and reorganized. The orchards were replanted with varieties Jefferson had been planning to add for years. The flower gardens around the house were redesigned, the oval beds on the west lawn were laid out in their final form, and Jefferson began the practice of maintaining detailed records of what was growing in each bed, with the same system he applied to the vegetable garden. He kept, alongside the garden book, a separate document he called the farm book, which recorded the agricultural operations of the Monticello plantation in detail. And he began, in these retirement years, a particular kind of correspondence, long, detailed, gardening letters to friends who shared his interests, exchanging not just plant material but ideas, observations, and the kind of intimate knowledge about what was growing and how that you can only share with someone who truly understands. His most important gardening correspondent in these years was Bernard McMahon, a Philadelphia nurseryman and author who had published in 1806 what was essentially the first comprehensive American gardening manual, the American Gardener's Calendar. McMahon had been a clearinghouse for plants brought back by the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he sent Jefferson extraordinary materials, seeds of plants collected from the far west that had never before been grown in the eastern United States. In return, Jefferson sent McMahon seeds from his own collection, including plants obtained from Europe and from the wider network of his international correspondence. The Lewis and Clark plants deserve a section of their own in the story of Monticello's gardens. When Jefferson had planned the expedition in 1803, with Lewis spending months in preparation in Philadelphia with the city's scientific community, one of his explicit instructions to Meriwether Lewis was to collect botanical specimens. To bring back seeds of plants that might be useful, or interesting, or new to science. To document the natural world of the interior of the continent with the same care applied to its geography and native inhabitants. Lewis and Clark did this, despite everything, the physical hardship, the logistical impossibility, the sheer weight of what they were carrying. The plant specimens Lewis brought back included dozens of species new to European science: the bitterroot, the Clarkia, the Oregon grape, the Lewis's monkey flower, the beautiful yellow flowering currant that still bears Lewis's name in its botanical designation. Seeds of many of these were sent to Jefferson and McMahon, and some were planted in the Monticello garden. Jefferson grew Osage orange trees from seeds Lewis brought from the Missouri River country, a tree with enormous thorns and inedible fruit the size of a tennis ball, interesting not for any practical purpose but for the intrinsic fascination of a tree that grew nowhere in the eastern world. He grew snowberry and bitterroot, and several grasses from the western plains. Each was a kind of messenger, a living thing that had traveled from the continent's interior to the mountain above Charlottesville, Virginia, carrying some quality of the landscape it had come from. This is something worth savoring. Jefferson was, in a real sense, bringing the American continent to his garden. The seeds that Lewis collected on the banks of the Missouri and the Columbia, seeds of plants that had never been grown east of the Mississippi, arrived at Monticello and went into the soil there. Some survived. Some didn't. But the attempt itself was the thing, the reach toward the whole of what the country was, the desire to know it, to touch it, to grow it in a place where it could be watched and measured and understood. The retirement years also brought a different kind of visitor to Monticello. Jefferson had always received visitors. Monticello was famous for its hospitality, and strangers as well as friends were welcomed, often for days or weeks at a time. But after 1809, when it became known that Jefferson was home for good, the flow of visitors became a flood. People came from across America and from Europe, making the pilgrimage to see the retired president, to see the famous house, and to see the gardens. Their accounts survive in letters and diaries, and they are invaluable as descriptions of what the garden looked like in its full maturity. Visitors consistently noted the vegetable terrace, with its extraordinary variety and its scientific organization. They noted the flower beds and their succession of bloom. They noted the orchards and their impressive extent. And almost all of them noted Jefferson himself, the old man in the garden, early in the morning, moving between the rows with a basket, examining something, making a note in the small book he carried. He was, by all accounts, completely at home there. More himself in the garden than anywhere else. The formality that sometimes characterized his public presentations, the reserve, the intellectual distance, was absent in the garden. He talked freely about what he was growing, explained the varieties, shared his observations about what worked and what didn't, let himself be genuinely enthusiastic about a particularly fine bean or an early pea. His grandchildren were constant companions in these years. Jefferson had 12 grandchildren from his daughter Martha and her husband Thomas Mann Randolph Jr., and several of them lived at or near Monticello. They followed him in the garden, as children do, asking questions, helping with small tasks, absorbing the knowledge and the habits of attention that Jefferson was always, whether consciously or not, teaching. One of his granddaughters, Ellen Wales Randolph Coolidge, left a particularly vivid account of mornings in the garden with her grandfather. She remembered the precision with which he marked and recorded everything, the care he took explaining plant names and habits, and the unaffected delight he took in the garden's small pleasures. She remembered, specifically, the strawberry beds, how Jefferson would sometimes stop in the middle of a garden walk to pick a ripe strawberry and give it to a grandchild, saying nothing, the fruit itself being the whole of the message. This image, the old man, the child, the strawberry, is somehow the most Jeffersonian thing in this entire story. All the philosophy, all the statesmanship, all the grand ideas about liberty and nature and the improvement of the human condition, distilled, for a moment, into a single red berry in an old man's hand. But there was a shadow over these retirement years, growing steadily darker. And it was not political, not personal, it was financial. Part 10, Debt, Decline, and the Final Harvest. Jefferson's finances were, for most of his adult life, in a state of managed crisis that occasionally tipped into genuine disaster. This is not entirely his fault, though choices he made contributed to it. The deeper structure of the problem was the colonial inheritance, the debt system of Virginia plantation agriculture, in which planters borrowed from London merchants against the value of future tobacco crops, and the debt accumulated across generations, compounding interest building up over decades until it was essentially impossible to pay off. Jefferson had inherited debts from his father-in-law, John Wales, along with the land and the enslaved people that accompanied them, and those debts never went away. But Jefferson also spent freely. He built and rebuilt Monticello at enormous cost. He bought books compulsively, his library, eventually sold to Congress for $23,950, had cost him far more to assemble. He bought wine in quantities that a more financially prudent man might have hesitated over. He was generous to a fault with visitors and guests, and the hospitality of Monticello, which he genuinely valued and could not bring himself to curtail, was ruinously expensive. By the time he reached his retirement years, the debts were serious. By the last decade of his life, they were catastrophic. He borrowed against future income, sold land to cover interest payments, watched the value of his tobacco crop fluctuate with the volatile commodity markets of the early 19th century. The enslaved workforce, the land, the house itself. All of it was mortgaged, in one way or another, against debts that seemed to grow faster than any harvest could repay. And yet the garden continued. This is perhaps the most moving thing about the Gardens of Monticello in Jefferson's final years. Despite the financial anxiety, despite the knowledge that the mountain and everything on it might have to be sold, he kept planting. He kept recording. He kept sending for seeds and testing varieties and noting what bloomed when and how many days it took the peas to come in. The garden book continued its steady, patient record right up to 1824, just 2 years before his death. There is a quality of faith in this that is difficult to name precisely. Not religious faith, exactly. Jefferson was a complicated religious thinker who kept his private beliefs largely private. But something like it. The conviction that the work of tending a garden matters regardless of what the future holds. That paying attention to the living world is worth doing for its own sake, whether or not you will be there to see the result. In the early 1820s, Jefferson received disturbing news about his finances that led him to apply to the Virginia legislature for permission to conduct a lottery, to sell off enough of his land and property through a public drawing to clear the worst of the debt while retaining Monticello itself. It was a measure of extraordinary personal humiliation for a man of his pride and his public standing. The application was eventually granted, but the lottery never achieved its purpose. Sales were disappointing, the debts were not cleared, and Jefferson died in 1826 still owing more than he could pay. The spring of 1826 found Jefferson at Monticello in declining health. He was 82 years old, his kidneys failing, his body worn down by decades of physical activity and the accumulated wear of a long life. He had written letters to friends and family with the quiet awareness of someone who knows the end is approaching, who is putting things in order, who is taking account. But he still went into the garden when he could. There is a family account recorded by his granddaughter of Jefferson, in the spring of his last year, being helped out to the garden by one of the household enslaved workers. Some accounts say it was Burwell Colbert, his butler, and one of the people he later freed in his will, and sitting in a chair set among the vegetable beds, directing the spring planting from a seated position when he could no longer walk the rows himself. He dictated to whoever was nearby what should go where, which variety should be tried in which square, whether the soil there was ready or needed more time. The garden was still being planned even as the planner was preparing to leave it. Jefferson was buried at Monticello, in a small graveyard he had planned himself, near the grove on the east side of the mountain. Wormley Hughes, the gardener who had spent his life tending the mountain's soil, is believed to have helped dig the grave. The man who had spent 50 years growing things from the Monticello earth was returned to it. After Jefferson's death, the debts descended. Monticello and its contents were sold at auction in 1827. The enslaved community, the families who had lived on the mountain, in some cases for 3 and 4 generations, were dispersed at the same auction, families broken apart, people sold to buyers from across the South. It was a rupture of extraordinary violence and sadness, and it is the final consequence of the great contradiction that had always sat at the heart of Monticello. The house passed through several owners over the following decades, falling into disrepair before eventually being acquired by Uriah Phillips Levy, a naval officer who admired Jefferson deeply and who made efforts to maintain the property. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation eventually acquired it in 1923, and the long work of restoration and scholarly research that has made Monticello what it is today, one of America's most visited and most studied historic sites, began in earnest. The garden, as Jefferson had kept it, was largely overgrown by the time restoration began. The vegetable terrace had been reclaimed by forest. The orchards were a fraction of their former extent. The flower beds had vanished. But the bones of the landscape were still there, the retaining wall, the level terraces, the paths through the grove. And the garden book was there, in the archives, a complete record of what had been planted and when, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the care to use it. Part 11, The Restoration and What the Garden Teaches U.S. Picture a small building at the edge of a very long terrace on a Virginia hillside. Inside the building, which is the restored garden pavilion that Jefferson originally called his weeding house, a place to retreat from the sun, to sit and record observations, to shelter briefly before returning to the rows, there are tools hanging on the wall. Hoes and rakes of a period design, the handles worn smooth with use. A watering can. A basket of the kind Jefferson carried on his morning rounds. Everything is quiet. Outside the narrow window, the vegetable garden stretches away to the west, its numbered squares filled with the same varieties that Jefferson grew 2 centuries ago, labeled with their period names in the precise style of the 18th century. This is what the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has created at Monticello, not a recreation, exactly, but something more careful than that. An evidence-based restoration, using Jefferson's garden book, his letters, his farm book, the records of his plant orders and his seed exchanges, and the findings of extensive archaeological investigation to reconstruct, as accurately as scholarship permits, what Jefferson grew and how he arranged it. The process began seriously in the 1980s, under the direction of garden historian Peter Hatch, who became Monticello's director of gardens and grounds and who spent decades both restoring the physical garden and researching and writing about Jefferson's gardening life. Hatch's book The Gardens of Monticello, published in 1992 and revised since, is the definitive scholarly account of the subject, and it is a book of genuine beauty as well as scholarship, a testament to what careful attention to evidence can recover from the past. The restoration of the vegetable terrace was the first major project. The retaining wall, which had partially collapsed, was rebuilt using period techniques and materials. The terrace surface was graded back to its historical level. The numbered squares were laid out according to Jefferson's own plan. And then the planting began, the patient, season-by-season process of re-establishing the varieties Jefferson had grown, testing how they performed in modern conditions, identifying which period varieties were still available from specialty seed companies and which had to be sourced from seed-saving organizations and heritage collections. Some of the varieties Jefferson grew have survived in cultivation continuously since his day. The tennis ball lettuce, a butterhead variety that Jefferson grew in quantity and mentioned in his garden book, is still available from specialty seed sources. The ragged jack kale, which Jefferson called bricole, is still grown. The Coeur de Boeuf tomato, an extraordinary heirloom variety with a ribbed, heart-shaped fruit and rich, complex flavor, has been recovered and is grown in the restored garden. Other varieties required more searching. The particular pea varieties Jefferson grew are not always easily traced. The same variety name was sometimes applied to different plants by different growers in the 18th century, and what Jefferson called the Hotspur pea or the Marrowfat pea may or may not correspond exactly to modern varieties carrying those names. The restorers have been careful to note these uncertainties, distinguishing between what is documented and what is plausible. The orchard restoration has been equally careful and in some ways more dramatic. The South Orchard now contains trees of many of the varieties Jefferson grew, planted in the rows he specified, producing fruit that visitors can sometimes taste. There are Newtown pippin apples, still one of the finest in existence, still producing that characteristic green-yellow skin and the aromatic, slightly tart flesh that Jefferson valued. There are Hughes crab apples, still making extraordinary cider. There are Esopus Spitzenberg apples, just as Jefferson described them, crisp and rich, one of the best eating apples in the American heritage. The flower gardens have been restored around the house, the oval beds, the winding border, the climbing roses on the south wall. The grove has been managed back toward Jefferson's intended condition, the understory cleared, the ornamental plantings re-established, the walks reopened through the thin forest. But the most important achievement of the restoration is not botanical. It is human. Over the past several decades, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has made increasingly serious efforts to recover and tell the story of the enslaved community at Monticello, to name the people who are known from the records, to describe their lives as fully as the evidence allows, to acknowledge the foundational role that their labor played in everything Jefferson built and grew. The Getting Word African American Oral History Project, begun in 1993, has gathered testimony from descendants of the enslaved community of Monticello, people who carried family memories forward through generations, who knew the names of ancestors and something of their lives, who could provide information about Monticello's enslaved community that the documentary record alone could not supply. These oral histories have complicated and enriched the portrait of Monticello in ways that the garden's physical restoration alone could not. The quarters along Mulberry Row, the enslaved workers' living and working area that ran along the south side of the main garden terrace, just a few dozen feet from the vegetable beds, have been partially excavated and are now interpreted with care for visitors. The stories of specific individuals, Wormley Hughes, James Hemmings, John Hemmings, Sally Hemings and her children, Joseph Fawcett and his family, are told now as part of the Monticello story, not as footnotes but as full accounts in their own right. This matters for the garden story in particular. The interpretation of Jefferson's vegetable terrace now includes, alongside the plant varieties and the garden book entries, the account of who did the work. Visitors learn that the beautiful garden they are walking through was created by enslaved labor, that the knowledge that maintained it was partly the knowledge of the enslaved community, and that the complicated human history of the mountain is inseparable from its soil. The garden teaches us, in other words, the same lesson that Jefferson's life teaches, that great things and terrible things can be intertwined, that beauty and injustice can grow in the same soil, that the work of honestly understanding the past requires holding both of these truths at once without letting either cancel the other. What Monticello has become, in the 2 centuries since Jefferson's death, is a place of extraordinary historical richness, not simple, not comfortable, not reducible to a single story. It is the story of a remarkable mind's engagement with the natural world. It is the story of an idealist whose ideals were compromised by the system he lived in. It is the story of enslaved people who built something beautiful under conditions of extreme injustice and whose contributions are only now being recovered and honored. And it is the story of a garden that outlasted all of them, that still grows, every spring, with tulips and peas and apple blossoms, on a small mountain in Virginia. The soil is the same. The view is the same. The Blue Ridge still runs along the western horizon like a slow, unhurried sentence. And every spring, when the first pea vines begin to climb their slender supports in the numbered squares of the restored vegetable garden, something of all those springs before, all those mornings when Jefferson walked the terrace with his notebook, when Wormley Hughes moved through the rows with his practiced knowledge, when the children played among the beds and the kitchen fires drew the smell of the season's first harvest into the air, all of it seems to breathe again, briefly, in the green climbing tendrils and the first white bloom. Part 12, The Legacy of the Living Garden and the Questions it Asks. In the early morning light of an April day at Monticello, before the visitors arrive, before the gates open and the paths fill with people, there is a brief hour of profound quiet. The mist still sits in the valleys far below. The Blue Ridge is the palest possible blue on the horizon, barely distinguishable from the sky behind it. On the long vegetable terrace, the rows are neat and ready, the soil dark and turned, the earliest plantings already showing their first true leaves, the tulip bulbs at the garden's edge beginning to open. A mockingbird sings from somewhere in the grove, running through its repertoire with the self-satisfied fluency of an amateur musician who has finally found the right instrument. Jefferson loved mockingbirds. He kept one as a pet, a bird named Dick, who rode on his shoulder and sometimes perched on the edge of his wineglass during evening meals. He wrote about mockingbirds with genuine warmth, calling them one of the finest songsters in the world. The mockingbird singing in the grove at Monticello this morning is not Dick, of course, and not any direct descendant of any bird Jefferson knew. But it is singing the same song, in the same air, above the same soil. This is what the legacy of a garden is. Not the specific plants, many of them have died and been replanted many times since Jefferson's day. Not the specific tools, not even the specific knowledge, though much of that has been carefully preserved. The legacy is the attention itself. The habitual practice of noticing, recording, trying, failing, trying again. The insistence that the natural world deserves our most careful and consistent observation. Jefferson's influence on American gardening and American agriculture is both direct and diffuse. Directly, he distributed plant material, seeds, cuttings, scions, to an enormous network of correspondents, and many of the varieties he shared survived in cultivation because of this generosity. Some American apple varieties, some vegetable cultivars, some ornamental plants, trace their paths into American garden culture through Jefferson's hands, or through the hands of the nurserymen and seed companies he patronized and encouraged. His correspondence with James Madison about agricultural improvement, they were neighbors and close friends, and their letters about farming and gardening form a kind of sustained collaborative inquiry, helped shape the early American interest in scientific agriculture. Jefferson was a founding member of the Philadelphia Society for Promoting Agriculture and the American Philosophical Society, both of which served as clearinghouses for agricultural knowledge in the early republic. More diffusely, Jefferson helped establish the idea, not invented by him, but powerfully embodied in him and in Monticello, that gardening is intellectual work. That paying close attention to what grows and how is a form of thought, not merely a form of labor. That the person who maintains a careful garden diary is doing something philosophically serious, something worthy of the same respect as a scientific experiment or a philosophical treatise. This idea had a particular resonance in American culture, where the practical and the intellectual have always been somewhat in tension, where a certain suspicion of pure theory and a corresponding respect for hands-on knowledge has always run through the national character. Jefferson, who was both the most theoretical and the most practical of the founding fathers, the one who could write an immortal philosophical document in the morning and spend the afternoon measuring his asparagus bed, embodied a resolution to that tension that Americans have always found compelling. He was also, in ways that are increasingly recognized, an important early figure in the American interest in native plants and in the ecological value of the existing landscape. His insistence on growing American native plants at Monticello, his documentation of the native flora of Virginia in the Notes on the State of Virginia, his instructions to Lewis and Clark to document the plants of the interior, all of this reflects a sensibility that we might today call ecological. A recognition that the land has its own logic, its own complexity, its own value independent of what human beings can extract from it. This is a sensibility that has grown enormously in the 2 centuries since his death. The modern interest in native plant gardening, in ecological landscape design, in the preservation of heritage varieties and agricultural biodiversity, these are all developments that Jefferson, with his combination of scientific curiosity and deep attachment to a particular piece of Virginia land, would have recognized and celebrated. He would also, one suspects, have been fascinated by the modern science that illuminates the things he could only observe. He knew that different soils produced different plants, but he didn't know about microbial communities in healthy soil, about the mycorrhizal networks that connect plant root systems in ways that are only now being mapped, about the genetic basis of the varietal differences he so carefully observed and recorded. The tools of modern plant science would have delighted him. He would have wanted to use all of them. But he might also have insisted, with the gentle firmness of someone who has spent a lifetime paying attention, that no instrument is a substitute for being there. For walking the rows in the morning. For putting your hands in the soil. For watching, day after day, what a plant does in a particular spot in a particular year, in the particular light and temperature and moisture of a specific place on the earth. Monticello's restored garden has had an influence beyond its own borders that is worth noting. It has been a model and an inspiration for the broader heritage seed and heritage variety movement in America, the growing community of gardeners, farmers, and seed savers who preserve old cultivars for their flavor, their history, and their genetic diversity. Organizations like Seed Savers Exchange, which maintains one of the largest private collections of heritage vegetable varieties in the world, have found in Jefferson's garden book a kind of founding document, a proof that paying careful attention to variety and maintaining diversity was worth doing long before anyone used the language of biodiversity or food security. The Monticello Garden Shop, which sells seeds of the varieties Jefferson grew, has been one of the unexpected legacies of the garden's restoration. People come to Monticello, walk the terrace, see the numbered squares and the labeled varieties, and go home with a packet of tennis ball lettuce seeds or mortgage lifter tomato seeds or speckled lima beans. They plant them in their own backyards, in their own soil, in their own spring mornings, and something of Jefferson's long project of attention and observation continues, distributed into 10,000 small gardens across America. He would have found this more satisfying, one thinks, than most of his formal legacy. There is one more thing worth sitting with as we near the end of this long night's journey. It is something about the relationship between a person and a place, about what it means to choose a piece of earth and give it your sustained, lifelong attention. Jefferson chose his mountain when he was barely more than a boy. He chose it not because it was practical, the lowlands would have been easier, more productive, less expensive to build on, but because it moved him. Because from the top of it the world was visible in a way it wasn't from anywhere else nearby. Because it had a quality that he couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore, an invitation. A sense that this place was worth knowing deeply. He spent the next 60 years accepting that invitation. He learned the mountain with the thoroughness of someone who knows they will never fully understand it, noting where the frost settled first, where the soil was deepest, where the water moved in heavy rain, which spots were sheltered from the north wind and which were exposed. He learned it through all its seasons and all its moods, through drought and flood and the regular alternation of growing and dying that is what a garden does. And in learning it, he was also, in the way that all deep attention works, learning himself. The garden was not separate from his intellectual life, it was its center. The same habits of observation and recording that he applied to the plants in his garden he applied to everything else, to the birds he catalogued, to the weather he measured with instruments he had built himself, to the geological formations of the Blue Ridge, to the language and customs of the Native American peoples whose world his own world was displacing and remaking. The garden was where all of this came together. Where the political and the personal, the scientific and the sensory, the past and the future, where all of these found a single place to live. And it is still there. On a small mountain in Virginia, above a valley that has been farmed and fenced and subdivided and developed in ways Jefferson could not have imagined, the garden still grows. The vegetable terrace still stretches its 1,000 feet along the hillside. The apple trees still bloom in April. The mockingbirds still practice their complicated songs in the grove. The first peas still climb their supports each spring with a patience and reliability that seems, in the quiet early morning, almost like a kind of promise. Not a promise about any particular future. Just the quiet, reliable promise that spring makes every year, that the ground is not finished with us yet. That there is still time. That the seeds you put in the earth this season will, if the season is kind and if you have been paying attention, come up. Jefferson understood this promise better than almost anyone. He lived by it. He recorded it, year after year, in a small book with a brown leather cover, in handwriting that grew slightly less precise as the decades passed but never stopped being careful, never stopped paying attention to the exact date, the exact variety, the exact first bloom of the season. That is the deepest thing Monticello's gardens teach us. Not about horticulture, not about history, though they teach us those things too. They teach us about the practice of attention itself, how it accumulates over time into something that looks, from the outside, like wisdom, but feels, from the inside, like simply not being able to stop noticing how extraordinary everything is. A purple hyacinth beginning to bloom on a March morning in 1766. The date written down in a young man's hand. The beginning of something. Closing meditation. Let the mountains settle into darkness now. The garden is quiet. The last light left the Blue Ridge hours ago, and the stars above Monticello are very bright at this elevation, brighter than they would be in the city, brighter than most of us see them in our daily lives. The tulip poplars stand still in the windless night. The spring peepers are calling from somewhere down the mountain, in a wet hollow where a small stream finds its way. You have traveled a long way tonight. Across 2 centuries and across a small mountain in Virginia. You have walked the vegetable terrace in the morning and the grove in the afternoon and the orchard in the golden light of October. You have felt the texture of old soil turned by careful hands. You have heard the names of plants in English and French and Latin, names that are also a kind of music when you say them quietly. Let all of it settle now, the way good things settle, slowly, without effort, finding their own level in the quiet mind. Think of a garden you know, or one you remember, or one you only imagine. Think of a particular plant, the shape of its leaf, the color of what it produces, the smell of it in warm weather. Let that image rest in your mind without examining it, the way you let a candle flame rest in a dark room, present, gentle, not demanding anything. Your body is heavy. Your hands are warm. Your breathing is slowed to the rhythm of something much older than thought, in and out, the way all living things breathe, the way the garden breathes through its long seasons of growing and resting. The soil is resting now, under the cold clear sky of a Virginia night. The seeds are already there, waiting in the dark for the warmth that always, reliably, comes. The roots of the old apple trees are holding the hillside. The mockingbird has finished his singing for tonight. You are safe. You are warm. You have nowhere to be. The world's urgency has receded to the faintest possible distance, like traffic heard from a very long way away, present but irrelevant, not requiring anything of you. Let sleep come now, the way spring comes, without announcement, without drama, simply arriving because the conditions are right and the time has come. The garden will be there in the morning. The peas will still be climbing. The tulips will still be opening, one by one, in the long beds along the hillside. And the mountain will be quiet. As quiet as this. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.